Hi, welcome again to Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice. My guest today is Christopher Hansard. He's the author of the Tibetan Art of Living and the Tibetan Art of Positive Thinking. He's flown here from London to be with us today. Welcome.
Hi, thank you very much.
Good to have you here.
Sure.
Now, you've studied ancient Tibetan traditions almost your entire life. Begin by introducing us to the Bon culture.
Well, the Bon culture is the pre-Buddhist culture of Tibet, and it had existed in Tibet for, say, at least 20,000 years, both with its own language and social systems prior to the advent of Buddhism, which came quietly at first, and most people weren't very interested. And then as the Bon kingdom, because Tibet was a series of kingdoms, began to implode, the Buddhists came back with the help of various local Maharajas who wanted to invade the country. And so the cultural process of the Bon teachings is all about the process of self-empowerment. So in some respects it's a very modern philosophy, but everything that we take for granted, like the idea of the Dalai Lama, the red robes, the typical Tibetan architecture, all this comes out of the Bon culture.
Okay, and then the Durban set of religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs.
Yes.
What are some of the most fundamental things there?
Well, the most fundamental one is that each of us live in the material world, and that we are responsible to ourselves for creating what's called empowerment. In other words, you have to get your house in order before you can go on a higher spiritual path. And so the teaching is very much about this everyday life, understanding where your compassion, your sense of personal responsibility and your responsibility to other people come from. And so the most basic teaching is about developing a role in the world whereby you can be responsible to yourselves and other people in a carefree but easygoing way. And in that you find all the spiritual need that you would require.
And as I read through both of your books there, the ideas seemed like very reasonable ideas. There was nothing that shocked or appalled me. It seemed very well rooted in day-to-day reality. Absolutely, and experience, yes. And useful stuff. Yes,
well, it has to be, because if you write books like this for people, you have to unfortunately assume the lowest common denominator, or so my publishers keep telling me. And
no, don't listen to them. Whatever you do, don't listen to them.
No, absolutely. But you have to deal with things that people need. And I was nagged by people who I've taught, and monks and nuns and lay people around the whole world, to write a book that would bring the simple things, or the lasting eternal truths in simple ways, and to try and bring a condensation of Tibetan culture in 200 pages. And that's what I did. It's
a big task.
Absolutely. And I thought, with the first book, instead of writing some scholarly teaching on the art of Tibetan medicine, I should present it as a lifestyle process, how people can learn the theories and the concepts of Tibetan medicine, but apply it as a lifestyle guide to empower them in their daily lives in the Western world. I'm not interested in trying to encourage people to give up what they know, but to understand what they have.
Yes.
And with the second book, that comes back to the basic truth that I think most people would respond to, that most people in the West have forgotten how to think.
And a very essential skill that is.
Yes.
Now, your own story, you're originally
Yes.
from New Zealand,
That's
which
right.
is the other side of the world, but it's still a long way from Tibet. How were you introduced to these ideas?
Well, Tibet came to me. I was 4 years old when I met my teacher, and he had, through a series of very involved astrological calculations from his teachers and other people.
He was looking for you?
Yes, he came searching for me and found me, and he was in New Zealand 5 years prior to my birth. And when I was 4, he approached my parents, and slowly over a period of months they got to know him and he got to know them. And I went through a series of so-called examinations, I suppose, to see if I was suitable for training. And I trained from the age of 4 until I was 27 years old.
Well, this is an incredibly unusual kind of childhood. I was maybe trying to figure out baseball or something at 4 years old.
Stealing fruit, baseball, playing football, getting in trouble, all those were part of growing up as well. Okay. Taking my boat out on storms, those kinds of things. And the typical things that boys get up to, peering through at girls and changing sheds, all the things that kids do. I
was curious about that. I mean, did you suddenly become this serious, studious person who...
No, well, it's a process, you see. Within the culture that came looking for me, they believed that it was their job to remind me of what I knew. But in the Bon culture, we don't have this process of taking people like myself out of the world. it's in fact very much the other way. One is involved in the world, and you learn your spiritual training or your cultural training inside the everyday world, and so that's where you learn the lessons of any lasting importance. And so I was encouraged to be a normal kid and not to think myself extra special in any way at all,
right.
Which of course no one is.
What was your parents' reaction to this?
Well, they were of course slightly shocked, because anyone who's a parent, me included, who is a parent, you think, what is this man about? But as they got to know my teacher, and he explained to them why he wanted to teach me, and they felt that I was this person who embodied a certain sacred knowledge, they slowly came around to the idea that, you know, this wasn't a madman who'd come in, you know, all the way from Asia. But New Zealand was a very kind of conservative country, and of course the World War II was just, you know, a recent memory, and people were very unsure about anyone who was different. Mm-hmm. So as they got to know each other, they became friends, and they realized that actually this was something which I had a calling for, because there were lots of indications prior to him turning up that in fact something strange was happening to their kid.
Oh. You were expecting this to happen even
Of course,
before, weren't you?
Absolutely. Well, prior to that. I mean, from my own viewpoint, New Zealand is a very quiet country to be born into. There's not much birth traffic. You know, you can choose a womb, it's comfortable.
Yes.
Not much is going on, and it's like landing in Halifax. It's easy, it's comfortable.
Yeah. Now, you heal people. This is your life's work.
Yeah.
What kinds of techniques do you use?
Well, it depends on the illness, whether it be psychiatric or psychological or physical. It ranges from people with terminal illnesses or undiagnosed psychogenic conditions, people with different kinds of cancers, blood diseases, kidney disorders, it goes on and on. Any kind of ology and iatry you can think of, Tibetan medicine can work with, because I see myself as a physician of Eastern Orthodox medicine, because Tibetan medicine was the orthodoxy of Asia up until as late as the 1920s.
Yeah. Is the traditional, well, what we think of the Western traditional
Yes.
medical community, do they find this acceptable, or do you get some
Yes, well, I've never had any problems from Western doctors, and I work with many Western doctors around the world to treat conditions that require different kinds of approaches, and so much so that next year I'm starting to teach at the University of Vienna. I'm teaching consultant surgeons and doctors and family doctors and psychiatrists and other health professionals aspects of Tibetan medicine relevant to their speciality.
Do you perform miracles?
I wake up in the morning. I performed a simple miracle in that I encourage people to realize that they can actually heal themselves. Yeah. Some people would regard that as miraculous. I see that as a result of my training and the compassion that exists in all living creatures.
Can you tell me a story maybe about one of your patients and methods of treatment?
Sure. Recently I had a patient who's a well-known artist in England who came to me. He's a mountain of a man, to use a North American phrase, and he was, for 2 years, had been ill on and off. And he started to lose a great deal of body weight, huge amount of body weight. And he came to see me, and he said that he'd been to see his local doctor and he couldn't find anything wrong, but he was still losing all this weight. So I did a Tibetan pulse diagnosis and urine analysis and came to the conclusion that in fact he had a severe form of cancer, and it was a form of liver cancer. And this particular kind of liver cancer, if it was dealt with in its early stages, could be dealt with. And so I immediately referred him to a hematologist I work with at a local hospital. And we got him to the hospital, and they were able to intervene with the right kind of surgeons, and he is now having a normal life. So this is an example because his condition had become so serious that he was in a critical point where he could have seriously collapsed. And those kinds of examples of, as we were talking about earlier, of a fusion between Tibetan medicine and Orthodox Western medicine. I did the diagnosis, they got him well. Mm-hmm. And so the process is that the Tibetan medical process was able to find out what was wrong and explain it to a patient and to a hematologist in a Western way.
Yes.
And I have those kinds of examples for many different kind of situations.
You say in your book, healing is not just making a sick person better, it is about making that person more conscious.
Absolutely, because if someone is ill and they and they recover only physically, they still have the patterns of illness within them, and they may not have the knowledge of how to stay well. And so therefore, any illness of a serious nature comes from an inner state of mind. This doesn't mean that, everything that is of a physical nature comes from within, but there is a relationship that will continue it on. And so when you're talking about serious illnesses, there is a direct relationship between the mind and the body and how they talk to each other. So from a Tibetan viewpoint, any serious illness is an expression of your mind and body not working in any state of harmony.
Right. Right. You believe in reincarnation?
That is a loaded question, and you have to. And the question is, do you know what reincarnation is?
I'm assuming that it involves living several lifetimes.
Well,
dying, coming back to life.
There's reincarnation is is a situation that happens to very few people.
Coming back is the single identity?
No. Most people, from a Tibetan viewpoint, have rebirth, and that is they die.
Yes.
In a confused state, or worrying about whether they turned off the gas or the electricity, or they have some concerns about their daily life. They die, and unfortunately they come back into a womb as quickly as they are dead. But there are those few people who have learnt control over their psychological and mental structures, so they can determine the way they die and what happens to them afterwards, and those are the people that reincarnate.
Do you have memories of previous lives, of your own?
Yes, but that's not important, because the life to be concerned about is the one from this moment until your birth, the past life. That's the only one of any importance.
Now, you began to describe something there that I was interested in. I was going to ask you.
Sure.
It's the big question. What happens when we die?
Well, death is two things, first of all. It's both psychological and physiological. And as people die, they begin to deal with all of those fears and worries which have never been healed. And so the first thing one begins to experience is a heightening of your senses. All your senses become very acute, your memory becomes very active, you begin to remember things you thought you'd forgotten. Every person you've ever loved and hated comes back in full glorious technicolor, and you begin to experience a heightened state of consciousness. So the potentials that are within us all become more prevalent as we die. And in that process of death, we become aware of all our imperfections, and they can take on different psychological structures. They can be very scary, or they can be very beneficent. And we often get ourselves caught between both those experiences. And the whole process is to realize that the good and the bad, so to speak, are both unreal. And that in between is an inner state of well-being and calm. And that is the state that if you connect with that, then you come to a point, regardless of your life, you are able to transform yourself and move on to a state of reincarnation as opposed to rebirth. So you don't have to be a special person to actually really to reincarnate. Everyone has the ability to transform their life as they die.
We're going to take a short break right now, and we'll be back with Christopher Hansard right after this.
This series is brought to you as a public service by Mount St. Vincent University.
Welcome back to the show. My guest today is Christopher Hansard. Many of these ideas that we're speaking about come from ancient Tibet, and it seems as if Tibet has given us many powerful traditions that just really in this century the West has woken up to. What is that about? Why Tibet? Why that particular geographical location?
Well, I think it's unique culturally, and also many other cultures have migrated through Tibet. Many Central Asian tribes and Himalayan tribes have come into Tibet and stayed there. And you must understand the concept of Tibet, first of all, is a Persian idea. This idea of Tibet is known in Tibetan as Bud, and Bud means the organization of kingdoms.
Yes.
And so we're talking about many small kingdoms who, prior to the Dalai Lamas, were ruled by a paramount chief or king. So you could think of Tibet as being run by a series of clans. tribes. And all these different tribes had come from many different parts of Asia. And only very few of them were actually indigenous Tibetan. So when you say, this person's Tibetan, they may be Turkic in origin or Mongolian, they could be Persian in origin, they could be, Pakistani. I mean, they could have come from anywhere in the Middle East or Central Asia. So therefore, Tibet has had an amalgamation of spiritual beliefs, but which have kind of coalesced into the ancient pre-Buddhist teaching. And that in itself has been so powerful that the fifth Dalai Lama said, although I am the Dalai Lama and a Buddhist by calling, I am Bon by nature.
Does that stem from a kind of shamanism even that
Well,
preceded
shamanism is the popular attribution to the Bon culture, but there's no such word as shaman in the Tibetan culture. There are influences of shamanism that you get, but the shamanism that we perceive it as, as having animal guides and using kind of hallucinogenics and those kinds of things, don't really exist in the same way in Tibetan culture. The nearest thing that one would have to a shaman is a man or a woman who is trained in like a psychological teaching where they can release within themselves great powers that relate to kind of archetypal forces in nature and in human minds. So they use the underlying forces of the thought processes of people to perform acts of consciousness and miracles that we can't understand in the West. But they don't really, moan and groan. Although some of them may so-called, ask gods to come through them and speak, but that's really on the outside of the Bon or the Buddhist teachings. That's a subculture.
Back to your methods of healing for a minute. You say in your book we are conditioned psychologically to expect to be ill.
Yes, we are.
Why is that, and how does a person change that?
Well, have you ever been disappointed?
Often.
Yes. Have you ever been made sad?
I think so.
Have you ever been lonely?
Yes.
Angry?
Yes.
Greedy?
All of the above.
Lustful? Hateful?
I think so.
Yeah, well, there you are. Those are all the conditions for illness.
Yes.
And therefore, when we get ourselves attached to any of those experiences, then we become ill. So the illness comes from the attachment and the experience we have from the things we've just talked about. And some of those forces are so powerful and basic to our instinct and our desire to survive that they can form a connection in our bodies that can make the environment for our bodies to become ill.
Now, the way you describe it in the book, it doesn't seem like you're talking about denial of all of those things that you just labeled that I have been at various times.
We all have, haven't we?
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. So to get past that, though, it's not so much denying that they exist and shutting them down, but how would you describe it?
If you deny them, you'll get sick faster.
Right.
The idea is you have to acknowledge that you have these things and then release the potential within them to change them. Because, the Bon teaching says that if you were angry or if you were sad or depressed or lonely, or you can find the underlying essence of that and begin to turn it around. So the reverse or the essence of anger is wisdom. Now, everyone has the capacity to change these things. So all our so-called negative emotions are cures. They are powerful medicines that we can begin to transform and use to our advantage. So underlying all these external experiences that we have that make up our so-called daily life is an underlying sense of knowing. And when we contact that, we then discover that we have a personal wisdom, particular to us, which enables us to be able to heal our lives and find out what we know, and then apply that to the larger wisdom of our community or our country or our friends or any religious beliefs that we have. So it's important to understand that Bon teaches Bon as a process to understand how wise you are inside.
If you'd like more information about this program or any of the courses we offer at a distance, call us or visit our website. We welcome your comments.
So welcome back to the show. My guest today is Christopher Hansard. You write a lot about the concept of non-attachment. How does a person train himself to be detached when we've grown up in a world of society here where we own things, everything from our identity to the car in the parking lot.
Sure. Well, it comes back, this thing you have asked me comes back to the underlying theory of Tibetan medicine and all Tibetan spiritual teachings, regardless of their label, and it's this. You and I, we live in the world of our senses. Our five senses take everything in, and they create the reality that we experience. But as we have so much information coming into us, our brain has to pause for a microsecond in order to make sense of that. Now, in that gap, in that pause, that's where we make who we are. You, me, we create all our identities. And we believe this identity, this everyday life to be true. But it creates for us this great illusion, which is called the present, or the moment. But in fact, there's no such thing, because everything that we experience through our senses to our brain, and then there's this gap, is in the past. So we're constantly living in the past.
Ah, a bit of a time lag.
Yes. So therefore, to understand non-attachment, we have to transform our senses in such a way that we can then perceive reality directly. And because reality is so huge, it would overwhelm most of us. So we have to learn means of beginning, we have to learn some way of catalyzing reality so we can begin to understand it in a marginal sense. So therefore, the best way to understand non-attachment is to realize how attached you are to things, to people, to habits and routines. And as I said earlier, find out what's behind them, what's at their essence. And then you can use the essence of that to begin to free your attachment. And it's very easy to give up attachments. But this means that because you have a job and a car and you're doing well, you shouldn't throw it away. To give up non-attachment, you have to realize the value of what they are and how they help you to move forward in your life, so you don't be owned by them, but you use them to support your underlying consciousness.
Go up and find a mountain somewhere really far away, maybe in the Himalayas or something, and sit on top and get away from the thought pollution?
No.
I can't.
But you can do it inside right now here in Halifax.
Okay, tell me, I'm going to leave this TV studio sometime today.
Well, I hope so.
And what can I do to move
You
away
and
from
anyone can do the simple exercise, and it's called dissolving the heart. You close your eyes and you focus on your physical heart until you can feel it beating. And when you begin to feel it beating, you dissolve all your anxieties, all your worries, those thoughts and routines and habits that go through your mind all the time, the thing you woke up with in the morning, the thought you went to bed with at night. Let everything begin to dissolve into your heart. And as it dissolves into your heart, what will happen is that your mind will begin to slow. Your body will slow. And out of that slowness will appear a clarity, an energy of simple, pure innocence. And when you begin to make contact with that, you then begin to go into the world of original thought, because the Bon tradition says that most people only have 5 minutes of original thought a year.
5 minutes.
And they spend the rest of the year reacting to it. And when you begin to touch this ability for thought, of this original thought, your life changes.
Having trained from such an early age, and so many things, both spiritual and health and medicine and everything, do you ever feel like you missed out on something because of that focus?
Probably reruns of the Lucille Ball show.
Well, some of them were pretty good,
Fantastic. But on the big picture, no, because it's something that I wanted to do, and I had to go through this process for this knowledge to be used in a proper way. You couldn't make any shortcuts.
Can you envision your next life?
Yeah. Well, as I said earlier, yes. After this, I'll be going to have lunch.
And after that?
I'll be going to bed. And I'll be doing a workshop.
I thank you very much for joining us on the show today. I'm Leslie Choice. Our guest has been Christopher Hansard, and thanks for watching. See you again.